Thank
All
you.
right. Am I good to go?
Yes, please go ahead. Sorry about that.
Perfect. No, no worries. Okay. Yeah, thank you for having me here today. I'm excited to get to share with you a recent sort of perspective piece that my colleagues Simon Thorold, Cameron Braun, and myself put together on what I believe and what we believe is sort of a major misconception in the ocean science and policy fields that the ocean twilight zone is this ecosystem in the ocean that we have yet to impact in a major way. And that really depends on the lens through which I think you look at it, which I'll explain here shortly. So in the last, 10 to 20 years, there has been sort of, a coalescing in the ocean science and policy communities that, as the title here says, we need to study the ocean twilight zone before it is too late. And that is, again, the part of the ocean that's between 200 and 1,000 meters deep. And the main reason is that if you had asked marine scientists 50 or 60 years ago, what is out there in the ocean's midwaters, they would have said it is azoic, as in is devoid of life and is incapable of sustaining it. But of course, in the last 20 years, we've, as with many things in science, discovered that we were wrong. And in fact, the ocean's midwaters contain perhaps the single largest biomass of vertebrates on the planet, to the tune of many gigatons, never mind other cephalopods and crustaceans and gelatinous organisms that would further increase the scope of that biomass. And with that drastic change in how we view the ocean and what's out there, we are confronted with the fact that we have these major dark holes in what we even understand about the deep ocean ecosystems, and also the ecosystem services that they provide to us as people reliant on them. And that can be through one of two major ways. One is we believe that a lot of the prey out in the deep ocean function as food for many of the top predators that we target in global fisheries, things like tunas and swordfish that provide food security, nutrition, and of course, income and livelihoods. But the other one is also through potentially via the carbon cycle, whereby these organisms may help to capture carbon in the near surface and transport it deep into the ocean where it can be sequestered from the climate and potentially help in the greater climate change problem. So at the same time, we have this dark hole in our understanding. When people heard that there was all this biomass out there in the deep ocean, we started to have discussions about some industries wanting to try and extract all that biomass for fisheries, for either marine protein or nutraceuticals and other purposes. And so now people are saying, well, we need to build up our knowledge before we begin to harvest this ecosystem so that if we're going to do it, we can do so sustainably. And at the same time, there's, of course, burgeoning interest in the beginnings of deep sea mining now, the activities of which may affect properties of the water column that these animals call home. And that is all done in the backdrop of recent predictions that there are going to be global declines of pelagic fauna, especially in the midwaters, in a warming ocean and climate. Now, the issue here is that I believe is that a lot of this discussions happens under perhaps the conception or the assumption that fishing of the mesopelagic has yet to begin. And that is true if we're talking about the micronecton, or the small fishes like you see in the top left, the bristlemouth or myctophids, that we believe constitute the majority of biomass out there. However, it misses a fundamental part of that food web that has historically been woefully understudied. And that is what my colleagues and I like to call the dark web, or the mesopredators that you see in the middle of this slide. So historically, research first focused a lot on apex predators at the top, like billfish and tunas, things that are the historical targets and very valuable parts of commercial fisheries. In the last 20, 30 years, we've had this shift with acoustic technology and net tows towards studying the micronecton at the bottom of the mesopelagic food web. That is, those small fishes and invertebrates. But in the middle, we have these mesopredators, animals that are too big and fast to be captured by the sampling methods that we usually use for science in the midwaters, and that historically were rarely, if ever, captured by many industrial fisheries because they were too deep and nobody was really trying to target them purposefully. However, that's starting to change. And that's potentially a major issue, given that, as this diagram tries to show, these are mesopredators that may drastically help in linking energy flow from the small animals at the bottom of the food web to the big ones at the top. For example, you'll notice on each of the marlin and the tunas at the top, there's sort of this circular donut diagram. The blue portion of that on the right constitutes about 50% or more. And what that represents is the portion of the diet of these three animals from a study done way offshore, where more than 50% of their diet came from two families of these mesopelagic mesopredators alone. Just two families was more than 50% of their diet, meaning that our conceptions of their diet when they're, for example, in more coastal, seasonally productive regions, is only a snapshot of their reliance on resources in the ocean. And when they're out in the open, unproductive waters of things like the subtropical gyres, they are really heavily reliant on these mesopredators that we know almost nothing about. And I want to make a major point here, which is that recently with the approval of, the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction or BBNJ agreement, everybody has been celebrating that in the context of the mesopelagic. The idea being that because the BBNJ will help to manage fisheries that have yet to develop, ones that don't have existing management paradigms, it in theory will help to manage and coalesce effort in studying potential fisheries of the micronecton at the bottom of the mesopelagic food web, all those small fish and invertebrates. But that management paradigm slices this food web in half. The reason being is that the mesopredators are overwhelmingly captured in fisheries, such as those that use long lines, to capture things like tunas and billfish. And the reason that's a problem is that the BBNJ does not supersede the jurisdiction of any pre-existing fisheries management organizations. So all of those tuna fisheries are managed by regional fishery management organizations. And because these mesopredators are captured in them, they are subject to that jurisdiction and not the BBNJ directly. So we are making improvements on how we protect the mesopelagic, but it is key to recognize that our current management structure slices this food web directly in half and potentially leaves the mesopredators falling through the cracks of management. I now want to show you what I think is perhaps one of the most interesting and at times also alarming case studies on perhaps one of the few long-term catch records of these mesopelagic mesopredators in the ocean today. This comes from the US's Hawaiian longline fishery, which is based in the Hawaiian Islands and covers an area of about 13 million square kilometers in the Northeast Pacific. Now, this fishery started in 1917, but starting in about the 1990s, going into the early 2000s, it really started to change how it operated in fishing much deeper and at much larger industrial scale. And now I've divided these catch records, annual catches, in the number of individuals in the hundreds of thousands between mesopelagic mesopredators on the left, that's lancet fish, snake mackerels, pomfrets, and opahs. And on the right, we have the targets, tunas and swordfish. And on the left, you'll notice that this fishery has captured more mesopelagic mesopredators every year for the last 20-something years by hundreds of thousands of individuals versus those target tunas and swordfish that really drive the fishery on the right. And this is a key point to make. When we think about mesopelagic biomass, we're usually talking about small fish and squid, a myctophid that's maybe a few grams. But the fishes that we're talking about here, these mesopredators, often weigh anywhere between half a kilo to 10 or 20 or even 30 kilos on average. So these are big mesopelagic animals that are being harvested in the hundreds of thousands of individuals every single year at a far greater rate than the target fish are. Now, if you're wondering, what is the outcome of these harvests? What happens when these fish are captured? Well, a huge portion of the individuals represented here are lancet fish and a specific type of snake mackerel. And they don't really have any commercial value at the moment, and so they are discarded, or in theory, released back into the water. The problem is they have between an 80 and 100% post-release mortality rate, meaning you're basically just dumping dead weight back into the ocean, and the fish are dying even though they're not technically retained in the vessel. They get caught, they're dead when they hit the deck, and they get thrown back. Now, that's a major part of what is caught. The other part, though, is commercially valuable. And over the last 10 or 20 years has increased in value by over an order of magnitude and now pervades the global seafood market. So I'm going to show you a series of pictures from the Honolulu fish market where this fishery lands and sells its fish. The first of these here is a pallet of nothing but escolar, all of these fish weighing between 10 and 20 kilos apiece. And this is a true mesopelagic mesopredator. And you can tell by the eyes alone that they are adapted to the low light environment of this ecosystem. Next, on the left, we have a series of opahs. And on the right, pomfrets. And again, these are fish that are weighing between maybe 10 kilos on the right to the opals on the left are often in the 30, 40, even 50 kilo on average range, but can go even up bigger than that, over 100. So this is big mesopelagic mesopredator biomass that we're talking about. Now, this is one case study. It happens to be a fishery where we have a really good long time accurate catch record. But what is the global picture? Is this something that's happening more pervasively, or is it really this? There's a few case studies like this that are sort of standout examples. So it's pretty hard to go about and easily find everything you want to know and review everything about mesopelagic mesopredator catch. You really have to dig deep into fishery reports, different sort of community level studies that have been done. But we did so at length and we're able to put together this picture that there has been globally decades of this dark web fishing happening. So the color scheme that you see in the background here, that kind of yellow to green, represents total fishing effort from drifting longlines as calculated by Global Fishing Watch since about 2012. Now, I chose drifting longlines because that's the primary gear that catches these species. However, they do also get caught in other fisheries, things that use trawls, bottom longlines, or even gill nets and hand lines. And we looked at all these different mesopelagic mesopredator species and fishery case studies, and I've assigned them here into three major categories. The first, in the sort of dark gray, is what I call contributors. This is fisheries where individual species of mesopelagic mesopredators constitute at least 10% of the overall catch by number. Now, in many cases, that's indicating that they are just incidental bycatch to a fishery but are caught in sufficient numbers. However, a number of the fisheries marked here are actually targeted mesopelagic mesopredator fisheries. They are intended to catch only one or two of these specific dark web species, and that's how they've existed for decades. The next category in orange are what I call the risk category. This is where species in these fisheries exhibit characteristics that would classically dramatically increase the risks of unsustainable fishing practices to occur. So the first of these I already mentioned. This is species that have a really high post-release mortality rate, meaning even if you wanted to release them, you're not going to be able to do so successfully because most of them are going to die. Number two is a number of fishery management organizations conduct what they call a productivity susceptibility analysis of all the species they catch. The productivity part of that looks at what is basically the intrinsic population growth rate of this fish, meaning the higher that growth rate is, the less susceptible it is to fishing. Whereas a susceptibility part of that analysis basically says, does this fish even overlap with our fishery? You put those two things together and you get a vulnerability score. So we included anything that had moderate to high vulnerability according to these analyses. Lastly, we looked at studies that compared the logbook records as written down by fishing captains and compared that either to federal fishery observers or to electronic monitoring that showed rampant, widespread underreporting of these mesopelagic mesopredator fishes. And this raises an important point. That's because catch reporting is not mandated for most of these animals. The same reason why, if you were to go look at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, they would tell you all of these species are least concern. Why? Because there's no records of them being caught. But the reason there's no records is because there's no mandated catch reporting. So we have this sort of snowballing issue of not knowing what's really going on. The last one in red is what I call the impact category. That is mesopelagic species in these fisheries that demonstrate the hallmark outcomes of overfishing: decreased size, decreased age, spawner biomass, relative abundance, collapsed fisheries, relocated fisheries, decreased genetic diversity to the point that there is no potential for recovery. So this is a global problem, and it is happening all the time, everywhere, on a massive scale, and has really flown under the management radar and the discussion about what constitutes mesopelagic fishing, again, where people have largely focused on those small fishes, the micronecton at the bottom of the food web. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, well, how is it that species like this end up encountering these fisheries? If they're getting caught in big numbers, why don't we know so much about them? Well, as I said before, there's been so little research effort into them because until more recently, they were harder to even interact with. So recently, my colleagues and I did an electronic tagging study in collaboration with a longliner in the Northwest Atlantic to look at one species in particular, the bigscale pomfret, which is one of the bigger species of mesopredators. So in the green arrows in the top left, you can see where we tagged a number of these individuals at the break in the continental shelf, sort of just off the Northeast United States. And the red upside down triangles show where those fish displaced to anywhere from a few weeks to a few months later. And as you can see, just like a tuna or a billfish, they are highly migratory and transit from exclusive economic zones of a given country through areas beyond national jurisdiction, and therefore are the exact same kind of management problem that we've been dealing with for ages with these top predators that we typically think of as being the target of fisheries. Now, their movement behavior is fascinating. I've looked at a lot of tag data, and I've never seen anything quite like what these animals do. So we tagged one of these pomfret, for example, in the Slope Sea. This is the part of the ocean that's north of the Gulf Stream and in between there and the continental shelf break. And the Slope Sea is an area that has lower optical clarity. That is, light doesn't travel as far, so it gets darker at a given depth. And when the animal is there, you can see in panel C at the bottom here, they're typically migrating on a daily basis between about 400 meters during the day up to the near surface at night. But when they transit the Gulf Stream, they enter into an optically totally different water mass that has super clear water where light penetrates really deep. And at a given depth, that water column is much brighter. And their entire depth distribution shifts downwards hundreds of meters where they're remaining basically fully in the mesopelagic 100% of the time. So what does this mean for sort of food web interactions? Again, talking about those ecosystem services of potentially transferring energy from micronecton at the bottom to those apex predators at the top. So on the left here, I've zoomed in on 3 specific days of tagging data from our pomfret. And I'm going to use as reference on the right a single day of acoustic data from that same part of the Sargasso Sea. And what we see is that during the daytime, the pomfret are often going down, again, 500 meters, where they overlap with the primary deep scattering layer, which in the acoustics is this green band that you see here. So during the daytime, they can overlap with this prey resource. But then at night, they migrate up to about 300 meters deep and occupy a very narrow band of water. Now, that represents this kind of area here where there is really diffuse nighttime scattering, where we think that there are perhaps lower numbers, but there are larger micronecton available to them. But what's fascinating, you'll notice, is these periods of the crepuscular time, that is at dusk and at dawn, when these animals undergo these anomalous ascents, 50 to 100 meters higher into the water column than their nighttime depth would suggest they should be occupying. And what that corresponds to is the exact period of time in which a portion of the deep scattering layer is migrating up into the near surface to take advantage of sunlight-derived production. And it's in that super fine window that these pomfrets say, I'm going to chase these migrating layers up and I'm going to risk increased exposure to predation. Because the closer you get to the surface, the more sharks there are. What's fascinating about this from a fishery perspective, to give you a little anecdote, is there is a decades-old fishery in Galicia, Spain, that targets pomfrets. And the way they do it is they go out just before dusk, they set all their gear, they only soak the gear for 30 minutes, right at dusk, and then they pick it up immediately, which is totally different than how a long line would normally function that would set it all night long. And in that 30-minute window of fishing, they catch thousands and thousands of a smaller species of pomfret in the Northeast Atlantic. So there are fisheries tuned into this exact kind of mesopelagic behavior to take advantage of it and harvest them in big numbers. Now, this is how these mesopredators interact with their prey. What about their predators? Here is the unfortunate end of one of our pomfret deployments after a few months at sea, where on the left, the first 2 days here is the pomfret's in the near surface at night, migrates deep during the day, comes back up, goes back down, comes back up. Now we're in the near surface at night, and this is the danger zone because this is where all the sharks are in the North Atlantic. And you'll notice on the night of September 7th, this pomfret suddenly undergoes the fastest movement we ever saw one do, and it descended all the way down to about 1,000 meters, comes back up, and now suddenly exhibits a totally different vertical movement pattern and is notably 20 degrees warmer at depth than it should be, which means it ended up in the gut of a lamnid shark, probably a mako shark, but it could have been a porbeagle, and it could have even been a white shark. So this highlights this sort of trade-off between trying to chase prey farther up into the near surface at night, but exposing yourself to risk from the big predators like the sharks that are present in the ocean. Now, I want to end this discussion with the other major ecosystem service, which is that of the carbon cycle, in the idea that migrating animals of the mesopelagic can come up into the near surface during the nighttime, eat sunlight-derived production, and take that carbon and transport it deep into the environment, with the idea being the deeper that carbon gets transported and released when these animals defecate means going from tens of years in which this carbon might be trapped in the ocean to hundreds or even over 1,000 years. Now, let's look at this a little bit more quantitatively. This comes from a study by Boyd et al. In 2019 in Nature, in which they compared basically the carbon sequestration metrics of the mesopelagic migrant pump, what we're talking about, versus a number of these other particle injection pumps. And we don't need to know the specifics of the other ones other than to say that this migrant mesopelagic pump helps to put carbon in the ocean for about 500 years or more. It also has the second highest export rate and the second highest carbon storage after the gravitational pump, which is obviously happening everywhere all the time forever. So this migrant pump is extremely important. But here's the shocking part. These values are almost entirely based on zooplankton. And those values really come from the size of the fecal pellet and how fast it sinks. And you can imagine that the fecal pellet of a fish that weighs 20 kilos is probably a lot bigger and sinks a lot faster. And so the numbers that we have right now are really dramatic underestimates, especially when we think about looking at these bigger fish. And the point here is to say, if the ocean science and policy community is so concerned about future mesopelagic, scattering layer fisheries that are going to suck up all the micronecton and the effect that might have on carbon cycling in the future, they should be equally concerned about what has already been happening and been extracted over the last 2 to 3 decades in the open ocean via the removal of these mesopelagic mesopredators. And with that, I'd like to thank my colleagues, especially our longline collaborator, Captain Danny Mears, with a tagged pomfret in his arms there. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. That was a fantastic talk. I had no idea. I have to admit, I had no idea. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I've got lots of questions, but I should let the audience weigh in first in terms of whether they've got anything. So if anybody's got a question, please just raise your hand and let me know. Let me just keep a look. Can't really always see people on the screen. So maybe if I get started and then people can come in. That divide between BBNJ and the fisheries, that seems to be such a fundamental problem. How do we resolve that? Is it resolvable? Is that going to change legislation on one side or the other?
So I talked to some of the people, who were like at those big discussions when they were trying to define how the BB&J would be implemented. Namely, how would we institute this new high seas paradigm globally, given the background of existing fisheries management organizations? And basically, it was, they said when it came to the deliberations, so many countries objected to trying to apply to BB&J to anything that was caught in current fisheries that they basically just had to relegate it to the micronecton side of things. Now, I don't think that there was necessarily some big push per se to try and include everything under that, because that would have been impossible to convince everybody. But that's I asked people straight up, I said, but what about this part of the food web? And they said, it's just not in there. It's not part of it because they're caught by existing fisheries, and existing fisheries have their own management paradigms that are not superseded by the BB&J. End of story. So it is a hard line in the sand between what management is associated with different parts of the food web.
That's fascinating. So that sort of pushes the emphasis then to working with the existing fisheries to start recording this information. Is that the way we go?
Yes, and some of them do, or certain, for example, I showed all that long-term catch data from the United States. The reason from that Hawaiian fishery, the reason we have that is because there is this, there is a federal observer program where the government puts observers on boats to record what gets caught. And that way we actually have the exact records. But if you look at the log books from the fishers, they are not obligated to write down things that they're not obligated to write down. So why bother writing down I caught, a bunch of these things that I threw back over the side when I'm not obligated to. And the problem is that getting an existing regional fishery management organization to say overnight, we want you to record this now, it's not that simple. It requires, a huge vote among multiple countries to agree, even to say we want mandated catch reporting. Never mind, we should spend the time and effort to do a stock assessment, and we should do that every 5 years, and we should update it. And there's a huge amount of runway between where we are now and where we need to be on catch reporting and using that to actually understand what's going on. Because it took a lot of sort of sleuthing to even put together the picture that we did.
That is fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. I mean, it's on the one hand, it's worrying, but at the same time, just appreciating it is, yeah, absolutely. So unfortunately, we're up against half an hour. So I'm sure that Martin would be happy to answer any questions if people have, if you can put them in the chat or email him. But otherwise, thank you very much. That was a real eye opener. Thank you. Um,
Yep, you bet.
so